Away from home, away from everything and everyone I used to know, away from the luxurious life I used to live, I found myself living in a place I never imagined I would ever call home. In a faraway corner of La Alpujarra, a quiet rural region in southern Spain, I now wake up to the sound of birds instead of the engines of private jets, the distant barking of village dogs instead of security radios, and the gentle rustling of olive trees instead of the heavy footsteps of guards stationed outside my bedroom. My house is small, almost embarrassingly small compared to the mansion where I grew up. There is no marble staircase leading to a grand entrance, no chandelier hanging above a dining table large enough to seat 20 people, and no servants waiting outside my bedroom before I even open my eyes. I have a little kitchen, a modest bedroom, an old wooden table, and a small garden where I grow tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and whatever else survives under the Spanish sun. Sometimes, when I look around, I still find it difficult to believe that this is my life. But strangely enough, I have never felt richer. The people here know me simply as Amira. They don't care about my family name. They don't ask how much money my father has. They don't care which palace I grew up in, or how many cars were waiting in our garage. An elderly woman from the neighboring house sometimes leaves fresh bread outside my door. A farmer down the road once helped me repair my garden fence without asking for anything in return. Children run past my house laughing, completely unaware that the woman tending vegetables beside them once belonged to a family whose wealth could have changed their entire village. And I love that they don't know. My name is Amira Al-Hassan. I am 29 years old, and I was born in Saudi Arabia into one of the wealthiest Muslim families in the country. From the moment I entered this world, I was surrounded by things most people only see in movies: private aircraft, luxury vehicles, palace-sized homes, servants, drivers, security teams, expensive jewelry, designer clothes, international vacations, rooms larger than some people's entire homes. I never had to wonder where my next meal would come from. I never had to worry about the price of a dress, a car, a vacation, or even a house. If I wanted something, someone usually found a way to get it. If I wanted to travel, a plane was prepared. If I wanted to attend an event, security arrived before me. If I needed something, I only had to mention it. But there was one thing money could never give me: freedom. Growing up, I was constantly reminded that I wasn't simply Amira. I was an heiress. My family had plans for me. There were expectations surrounding my education, my friendships, my appearance, my future marriage, my responsibilities, and eventually, my place within the family empire. Every decision seemed to have a consequence. Every friendship was questioned. Every unfamiliar person was viewed with suspicion. Our home looked like a palace from the outside, but sometimes it felt like a beautiful prison from within. I remember standing beside enormous windows overlooking perfectly maintained gardens and wondering what life looked like beyond those walls. I would watch ordinary people walking together, laughing in public, buying food from small shops, and sitting together in cafes. They seemed so free. They could walk wherever they wanted. They could speak to whoever they wanted. They could make mistakes without an entire family structure collapsing around them. I had everything people dream about, and yet, somewhere deep inside me, I felt like something was missing. For years, I tried to silence that feeling. I convinced myself that I was simply ungrateful. After all, what right did I have to complain? I had been given more than I could ever need. Millions of people would have traded places with me without thinking twice. So I smiled. I attended family gatherings. I wore the clothes chosen for me. I entered rooms surrounded by people who bowed, greeted, and respected my family. I learned how to behave like the heiress everyone expected me to become. And I kept the questions inside. Until one night, everything changed. I cannot tell you that I woke up one morning and suddenly hated money. I didn't. I had loved the comfort it provided. I had enjoyed beautiful things. I had never imagined giving them up. In fact, if someone had told the younger version of me that I would one day leave my family's fortune behind and live in a tiny house among strangers in the Spanish countryside, I would have laughed in their face. But something happened to me. Something I still struggle to explain without feeling the same trembling in my hands that I felt that night. An encounter. An encounter that forced me to look at my life differently. An encounter that made me question what I had spent 29 years chasing. An encounter that made me realize that I could inherit billions and still lose something infinitely more valuable. Jesus. That name became the dividing line between the woman I had been and the woman I eventually became. I know what my family thinks. I know what many people would say if they heard my story. Some would call me foolish. Some would say I was manipulated. Others would insist that no experience could possibly justify walking away from a fortune that could have secured my entire future. But I know what happened to me, and that is why I am here, in this quiet village in southern Spain, living a life so ordinary that sometimes I forget who I used to be. The strangest part is this. I didn't leave billions because I hated wealth. I left because, for the first time in my life, I discovered something money could never buy. And what happened during that encounter with Jesus was so overwhelming that it changed not only what I believed about God, but also what I believed my life was worth. I was born into a world where the word expensive barely existed. Before I understood what money was, I understood that certain doors were not meant to be opened by ordinary people. Before I knew the meaning of inheritance, I knew that my family name carried weight. And before I was old enough to understand why strangers treated me differently, I had already learned that there were always people watching. My earliest memories are not of toys scattered across a small bedroom or children running freely through a neighborhood. They are of enormous rooms, polished floors, quiet hallways, and adults speaking in careful voices. Our residence was so large that there were sections I could go days without visiting. There were rooms reserved for formal occasions, rooms used only when important guests arrived, and private spaces where family decisions were discussed away from everyone else. There was beauty everywhere, but very little felt accidental. The gardens were trimmed perfectly. The flowers were replaced before they began to wither. Meals appeared at precisely the right time. Cars waited outside whenever we needed to go somewhere. My clothes were often selected before I even knew what event I was attending. There were people whose entire responsibility seemed to be making sure that my life contained no inconvenience. As a little girl, I thought this was normal. I thought every child had someone opening doors for them. I thought every family traveled with security. I thought having several people waiting to assist you was simply what adulthood looked like. I didn't understand that my childhood was unusual until I began meeting children outside my family's circle. My education was private and carefully controlled. The schools I attended were chosen not only for their academic reputation, but also for the families whose children studied there. My parents wanted me surrounded by people who understood our world. They believed they were protecting me. And perhaps, in their minds, they were. But protection slowly became supervision. There were rules about who I could spend time with. There were questions whenever I became close to someone outside our social circle. There were conversations about reputation, family dignity, and the consequences of making the wrong decision. I learned early that my mistakes would never belong entirely to me. Anything I did could become a reflection of my parents, my grandparents, and the family name. That realization changed the way I behaved. I became careful. I learned to think before speaking. I learned that there were certain subjects I shouldn't discuss at family gatherings. I learned that some opinions were better kept inside my head. I learned how to smile when I disagreed and how to remain silent when everyone else expected agreement. The older I became, the more complicated the expectations became. I was no longer simply a daughter. I was being prepared to become an heir. Suddenly, conversations about my future sounded less like conversations about my happiness and more like discussions about responsibility. My education had a purpose. My relationships had implications. My decisions had consequences. Even the way I presented myself in public mattered, because one day I might represent interests much larger than myself. There were people who envied my position, and I understood why. From the outside, my life looked almost perfect. But nobody saw what happened when the doors closed. Nobody saw me sitting alone in my room after a large family gathering, removing expensive jewelry from my neck and staring at myself in the mirror. Nobody saw the moments when I wondered why having everything had not made me feel complete. Sometimes I would look at the enormous bed in my room and realize that despite its size, I felt incredibly alone. I had people around me constantly, but very few people with whom I could speak without calculating every word. That loneliness became more noticeable as I entered my teenage years. I began discovering questions that nobody had taught me how to answer. Why did some children grow up without enough food while I had more than I could possibly consume? Why did people suffer from diseases that money could not cure? Why did innocent families experience tragedies while powerful people seemed able to protect themselves from almost anything? Why did some prayers appear to be answered while others seemed to disappear into silence? I wasn't trying to rebel. I was trying to understand. My religious upbringing had taught me to respect God, follow religious traditions, and understand the importance of faith. Those teachings were deeply woven into my family life. But as I grew older, I began realizing that repeating what I had been taught was different from truly understanding what I believed. That frightened me. I was surrounded by people who seemed completely certain about everything, while inside my mind, questions were multiplying. I remember one evening sitting alone after a family dinner. Everyone had already left the room, and the house had become unusually quiet. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps somewhere in the corridor. I looked through the window at the lights outside and wondered something I had never dared to say aloud. What if having a perfect life on the outside had nothing to do with having peace on the inside? That question stayed with me. I started paying attention to things I had previously ignored. I noticed the sadness in people who had wealth but no peace. I noticed how quickly some friendships disappeared when money or influence was removed from the equation. I noticed how easily people praised powerful families, and how quickly they turned away when those families experienced difficulties. I began wondering whether I was loved for who I was, or for what my surname represented. That was one of the most painful questions I had ever asked myself. There were nights when I would walk through the palace after everyone had gone to sleep. The enormous corridors looked completely different in darkness. During the day, they were filled with movement. At night, they became almost hauntingly silent. I would sometimes stop beside a window and look at the city lights in the distance. Somewhere beyond those walls, ordinary families were eating dinner together. Fathers were helping their children with homework. Mothers were preparing meals. Young people were laughing with friends. Couples were arguing about insignificant things and then making peace. Their lives were probably difficult in ways mine could never understand. Yet I sometimes envied them. They seemed to possess something I couldn't buy. Ordinary life. As I approached adulthood, my family began involving me more seriously in conversations about the future. I was introduced to responsibilities I had previously considered distant. Meetings became more frequent. I was expected to understand investments, properties, business interests, charitable foundations, and family obligations. The numbers were enormous. Sometimes I would hear figures discussed casually at the dinner table that would have changed the lives of thousands of ordinary people. But the conversations were conducted so naturally that nobody reacted. I began to understand what my inheritance could mean, and instead of making me excited, it made me uncomfortable. I wondered what would happen if I inherited everything everyone expected me to inherit. Would I finally be happy? Would I wake up one morning and suddenly feel complete because my name was attached to more money than I could spend in several lifetimes? I couldn't convince myself that the answer was yes. Then something even more unsettling happened. I began searching for answers privately. I read about suffering. I read about death. I read about forgiveness. I read about people who had lost everything and somehow found peace. I read stories of ordinary men and women who had endured unimaginable hardship yet seemed to possess a joy I could not find inside my family's world. The more I searched, the more restless I became. I wasn't looking for a new religion. At least, that's what I told myself. I was looking for truth. And without realizing it, I was walking toward a person my family never expected me to seriously consider: Jesus. At first, even that name made me uncomfortable. I had heard it before, of course. I knew what Christianity was. I had encountered Christians during my education and travels, but hearing about Jesus as a historical figure was very different from beginning to wonder who he actually was. I began asking questions I kept completely private. Why did Christians speak about Jesus with such personal devotion? Why did they describe him not simply as a prophet or teacher, but as someone who could transform a person's entire life? Why did his teachings about forgiveness, humility, sacrifice, and love seem so different from the world of status and power I knew? I didn't tell my family. Not my parents. Not my relatives. Not even the people closest to me. I was afraid of what they would think. So I continued living the life expected of me, while secretly carrying a growing storm inside. During the day, I could still appear confident and composed. I could attend family functions, wear beautiful clothes, smile for photographs, and discuss the future as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was beginning to understand that my greatest struggle wasn't deciding what I wanted to inherit. It was deciding who I wanted to become. And I had no idea that the questions I was asking in secret would eventually lead me to a moment that would completely shatter the life my family had planned for me. The night everything changed did not begin with thunder, a mysterious voice, or anything that would have warned me that my life was about to be divided into two completely different parts. It began with an argument, a serious one. By that point, the pressure surrounding my future had become almost unbearable. Decisions were being made about my life as though I were another asset that needed to be positioned correctly. My family believed they knew what was best for me, and perhaps they genuinely did. But for the first time, I found myself unable to quietly accept everything. That evening, a conversation about my future became more intense than usual. I remember sitting there listening to people I loved discuss my life, as if my own desires were secondary. I tried to explain that I was confused, that I needed time, that there were things happening inside me that I didn't know how to explain. Instead of understanding, I was reminded of everything my family had given me: the education, the protection, the opportunities, the wealth, the family name, the future waiting for me. I understood their argument, but something inside me was screaming that none of those things could answer the questions that had been growing inside me for years. Eventually, I walked away. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the floor beside my bed. For the first time in my life, I didn't care about looking composed. I cried. Not because I had lost anything. I cried because I suddenly realized how desperately I wanted something I couldn't name. Peace. Real peace. Not the temporary comfort that came from shopping, traveling, beautiful surroundings, or receiving something expensive. I wanted the kind of peace that remained when everything else disappeared. That night, I felt completely alone. I remember looking around my room and thinking about how strange my life was. Everything around me represented wealth and privilege, yet none of it could comfort me in that moment. There were expensive paintings on the walls, jewelry in a locked drawer, designer clothes hanging in my wardrobe, a phone that could connect me to almost anyone in the world, and still, I felt helpless. I began praying. I don't remember every word I said, but I remember the desperation behind them. I asked God to show me what was true. I asked him to forgive me for the things I had done knowingly and unknowingly. I asked him why I felt empty when my life appeared so blessed. And then I asked the question that had been frightening me for months. God, are you really hearing me? After that, everything became strangely quiet. I cannot explain exactly how long I remained there. Time seemed to lose its normal meaning. The sounds outside my room became distant. My thoughts became unusually still. Then I experienced something I have struggled to describe ever since. I became aware of a presence. At first, I thought it was simply the result of exhaustion and emotion. I tried to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the feeling became stronger. There was a peace in the room unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels empty. It felt alive. And then I saw him. Jesus. I know how impossible that sounds. Even now, saying those words makes me aware of how extraordinary my story sounds. But I am telling you what I experienced, not what I expect everyone else to believe. He wasn't standing before me the way a person would stand in an ordinary room. The experience was different from anything I had known. What struck me first wasn't fear. It was love. A kind of love that made me feel completely exposed. There was no hiding. No family name. No wealth. No reputation. No carefully chosen clothes. No security. No inheritance. Nothing I could use to make myself appear important. I felt as though he saw the entire story of my life at once. The things I was proud of, the things I regretted, the questions I had hidden, the moments when I had been selfish, and the moments when I had genuinely tried to do what was right. And yet I did not feel rejected. I felt known. That was what broke me. For years, I had lived among people who knew my family name, my position, and my responsibilities. But in that moment, I felt that someone finally knew me. Then came the message that I believe changed everything. I became painfully aware of how much importance I had placed on wealth. I had always told myself that I didn't worship money. I wasn't obsessed with counting bank balances. I didn't wake up every morning thinking about becoming richer. But suddenly, I understood that wealth had shaped almost every part of my identity. It had influenced where I lived, who I knew, what I feared, what I expected from life, how I measured success, even how I imagined my future. I realized that I had spent years preparing to inherit something that could never belong to me forever. One day, whether I wanted it or not, I would leave it behind. And I felt a question settle deep within me. What will remain when everything you can possess is gone? I had no answer. For the first time, billions sounded incredibly small. I thought about the enormous properties my family owned. The businesses, the vehicles, the jewelry, the investments, the accounts, the possessions that had always made our family feel secure. Then I thought about death. Every human being eventually stands before that reality. The richest person and the poorest person both leave this world without taking their possessions with them. That realization frightened me. I had spent so much of my life preparing to inherit wealth, but I had barely prepared my soul for eternity. Then I understood something else. The problem wasn't money itself. The problem was allowing money to become the measure of my worth. I had unconsciously believed that because I came from a powerful family, I was supposed to live a powerful life. I had associated comfort with blessing and hardship with failure. But Jesus showed me a completely different picture. He showed me that a human soul could possess almost nothing materially and still be extraordinarily rich. He showed me that a person could sit in a tiny room with no expensive possessions and yet have peace. He showed me that pride could live inside a palace just as easily as it could live inside a poor man's house. And he showed me that humility wasn't humiliation. It was freedom. Then came something I wasn't prepared for. Forgiveness. I saw the people I had resented. People in my family. People who had disappointed me. People who had disappointed me. People who had disappointed me. People whose words had wounded me. For years, I had carried those memories like invisible stones. I believed that if I forgave them, I would somehow be saying that what they had done didn't matter. But what I experienced that night made me understand forgiveness differently. Forgiveness wasn't pretending the pain never happened. It was refusing to allow the pain to own the rest of my life. I began crying again. I realized that I had been asking God to change everyone around me when perhaps the first person who needed to change was me. Then my attention turned toward eternity. That was the part I cannot adequately put into words. I became aware of how temporary everything I considered permanent really was. The mansion was temporary. The wealth was temporary. My appearance was temporary. My family position was temporary. Even my own life was temporary. But the value of my soul was not something that could be calculated with money. And suddenly I understood why I had felt empty. I had been trying to satisfy an eternal hunger with temporary things. No amount of wealth could fix that. No amount of attention could fix it. No luxury could fix it. No inheritance could fix it. I had spent years asking, how much will I have? But the question that mattered was, who am I becoming? The encounter did not leave me feeling like I had received a command to hate my family or despise wealth. Instead, I felt challenged to stop allowing possessions to control me. I understood that if I continued living only for money, status, approval, and inheritance, I could eventually possess everything my family wanted me to possess, while losing the person I was created to become. And that thought terrified me more than losing billions ever could. When the experience ended, I was still sitting in my room. The palace looked exactly the same. The expensive furniture was still there. The lights were still shining. My clothes were still hanging in the wardrobe. Nothing around me had changed. But I had. I looked at the room differently. For the first time, the things surrounding me no longer looked like proof that I had everything. They looked like reminders of how little material things could actually give me. I knew I couldn't simply return to the life I had been living. I knew there would be consequences. I knew my family would not understand. I knew there would be accusations, arguments, and perhaps even rejection. But another realization had become impossible to escape. I could inherit billions and still remain spiritually bankrupt. And if I had to choose between the fortune waiting for me and the peace I had discovered in Jesus, I already knew which one I was going to choose. What I didn't know was how much that choice would cost me. When I woke up the next morning, the palace looked exactly the same, but I felt like a completely different woman. The expensive curtains, the polished floors, the designer clothes, the jewelry, the cars waiting outside, everything that once impressed me, suddenly felt strangely empty. I started quietly giving things away. Handbags I had barely used, jewelry I had collected over the years, clothes that cost more than some people earned in months. At first, I gave them to people around me. Then I began donating money anonymously. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I simply couldn't look at my possessions the same way anymore. My family noticed. At first, they thought I was going through a phase. Then they realized I was serious. When I finally told my parents that I no longer wanted the future they had planned for me, the atmosphere in our home changed immediately. My father couldn't understand how someone who had been given every possible advantage could voluntarily walk away from it. "Do you understand what you're throwing away?" he asked me. I did. That was the frightening part. I understood exactly what I was walking away from. I was walking away from billions. The arguments became painful. I was accused of being confused, manipulated, ungrateful, and reckless. I was reminded that my decisions could embarrass the entire family. Eventually, I was warned that if I continued down this path, I could lose my inheritance completely. I remember sitting quietly and realizing that the threat no longer frightened me. For most of my life, losing my family's fortune had been one of my greatest fears. Now it felt like freedom. I looked at my father and said something I had never imagined I would have the courage to say. I would rather lose everything than lose what I found. That was the moment my family knew I wasn't changing my mind. I signed away my claim to the inheritance. Then I left. I didn't take expensive jewelry. I didn't take luxury cars. I didn't take servants or security. I took a few clothes, some personal belongings, my Bible, and the faith that had completely transformed the way I saw my life. For the first time, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward Jesus. When I first arrived in La Alpujarra, Spain, I had almost nothing that could impress anyone. No mansion, no chauffeur, no security detail, no servants, no expensive wardrobe waiting for me. Just a small house, a few bags, and a heart that was still trying to understand everything I had left behind. The first morning I woke up there, I heard birds outside my window. Nobody was knocking on my door to tell me where I needed to be. Nobody was waiting for instructions. Nobody was monitoring my schedule. For the first time in my life, I was completely responsible for my own ordinary existence. I made my own breakfast. I cleaned my own house. I walked to the local market. I learned how to grow vegetables. Sometimes I struggled with things I had never done before, and I laughed at myself. But there was something I had never experienced inside the palace. Peace. The people around me treated me like an ordinary human being. They didn't care about my family's fortune because they didn't know about it. They cared whether I was kind, whether I helped when someone needed me, and whether I was willing to sit down and share a conversation. That simplicity changed me. My faith also became more personal. I began spending more time praying, reading the Bible, and asking God to help me become the person I believed He wanted me to be. I wasn't suddenly perfect. I still had doubts. I still missed my family. Some nights, I cried because I wondered whether I had lost them forever. Forgiveness became one of my greatest lessons. For a long time, I blamed my family for making me feel trapped. But eventually I realized that they had acted according to what they believed was right. They feared losing me. They feared what my choices would mean for our family. Their reaction hurt me, but I no longer wanted to spend the rest of my life carrying anger toward them. So I forgave them. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with them. But I pray for them, and if they ever call me, I will answer. People sometimes ask me whether I regret walking away from billions. My answer is simple: no. I know what it feels like to have almost everything money can buy. I also know what it feels like to sit in a tiny home with very little and feel more fulfilled than I ever did inside a palace. Money can buy comfort. It can buy beautiful surroundings. It can open doors. But it cannot tell you who you are. It cannot heal every wound. It cannot guarantee tomorrow. And it cannot fill a soul that is searching for something eternal. I am still Amira. I am still learning. I still make mistakes. But now I measure my life differently. I don't ask, how much do I have? I ask, what kind of person am I becoming? And if my story has taught me anything, it is this: never assume that a person who has everything is truly fulfilled, and never underestimate the value of a life that money cannot measure. Because I once stood at the doorway of a fortune worth billions, and I walked away, not because I had nothing to lose, but because I finally discovered something I considered worth more: Jesus. So let me leave you with the question I have asked myself countless times. If you were given billions, but discovered that your soul was still empty, would you have the courage to walk away?